works at this second level of the factors of democratic performance. And finally, for two of the factors of rights, we have a third level that is below this, the sub-factors. So we have these for civil liberties and political equality. But most of the discussion this morning will be at this second level, the factors of democratic performance. So turning now to the principal findings of the report, just the top level takeaway messages. First, and you will have heard this, I'm sure, before, but there is a significant decline in democratic quality around the world. And in the last year for which we have data, about half of the countries of the world were declining in at least one of those factors of democratic performance. At the same time, 36% were experiencing progress. So it doesn't mean that all
Let's see. Okay, there we go.
Okay. I assume we had a technical difficulty, but you can hear me again now. Is that correct? Okay. I think we can continue then.
Everything is okay.
So I was saying that this follows up on the previous graph, and we could say that for each country in the world is it in a situation of net improvement or net decline? That is to say, is it improving in more areas than it is declining? And then we can look at the entire situation of the globe and how many countries are in net improvement and net decline, and then what is the global balance of democratic progress? And so this graph very simply illustrates that for 3.5 decades, there was a situation in which more countries were improving than declining every year. And then since 2016, we have a situation where more countries are declining than advancing. And this is the period of the crisis of democracy that we've talked about, or a global decline in democratic quality. But I think we always have to calibrate our level of concern by considering a pattern like this. So it is the case that there is a serious decline in democratic quality, but this decline follows a period of unprecedented expansion in democracy. And so even though we have experienced declines for these last 6 years, we remain near the global peak of democratic achievement. And so we're in a situation where we are struggling to maintain the gains and to expand them in new areas, but we are certainly not falling back to the level of democracy that was experienced in the world in 1980 or something like this. But we can look a little closer and say, among those many factors of democratic performance that we've measured, where are the particular areas of difficulty? And so these are a type of graph called a tree map, where the proportion of the square that is colored in the different shades indicates whether we're looking at a situation where most countries are experiencing no change or decline or progress. And what you see here is that for every one of these factors, most countries, in fact, are not experiencing a change. And yet, among those that are declining or improving, there are more countries declining than improving in some of the fundamental factors of democratic performance, including credible elections, access to justice, the effectiveness of the parliament, civil liberties, and elected government. And so when these fundamental aspects of democratic performance are declining, then we have a serious problem in democracy in those countries. There is one exception to this otherwise uniformly negative picture, and that is in terms of what we call absence of corruption, where actually more countries are improving than declining. This may be somewhat counterintuitive, but we can look at that again over time and see that in the period of great democratic expansion in the 1990s, there were actually many countries falling behind in terms of absence of corruption. And now when we have a period of democratic decline globally, we have twice as many countries improving than declining. And this is explainable in terms of the strong positive association between levels of corruption and democracy, but it's not a perfectly linear relationship. And so it is sometimes the case that a country may be falling behind in other areas of democracy and yet making progress in the fight against corruption. And in the opposite case, there are countries that have, for example, improved the credibility of elections and yet had increasing problems with corruption. So we want to look at this as one small area of progress, but of course to understand it as a fairly nuanced and complicated picture where it isn't always fully positive development. But another perhaps more promising area of progress concerns participation. So here we've graphed the level of rights protection and the level of participation in all of the 173 countries. And what you find is that at sort of mid-levels of rights protection, you already have high levels of participation. And so Indonesia is an example of this. Indonesia has basically a mid-range level of rights protection and yet a high-range score in participation. And you observe this in quite a few countries. This illustrates the fact that there is a large demand from members of the public to participate in public life, and even when their rights are not perfectly protected, even when there are challenges to expression and association, that people are willing to participate, that they want to be part of public life, to have their voice heard in politics. And so this is an area of relative strength that many countries can build upon, where the citizenry is engaged and they want to be part of things, and so we should build on this. Moving now to this concept of the new checks and balances, or as we call it, countervailing institutions, we can think about the ways in which we can expand the institutions that we consider when we think about how people maintain control of the government. That first principle of democracy that we talked about, that there is popular control over decision-making and decision-makers. So normally when we talk about checks and balances, we're referring to the horizontal checks on power that exist, where the legislature, the courts, and the executive engage in a process of mutual checking. But there are many countries in the world, as we illustrated with those graphs earlier, where the horizontal checks on power are not effective, that the legislature does not effectively question the executive and hold it accountable, that the courts perhaps are not as independent as they should be. And so in such a situation, where do we look for the maintenance of democracy? What is left that we can look to maintain popular control of decision-making? And so we've divided that further into a consideration of informal institutions and independent bodies that are part of this sort of system of countervailing institutions that serve to maintain public control over the government. And so in terms of informal institutions, we've considered civil society, trade unions, the private sector, and even public protests in the sort of last resort as a check on government power. But at the bottom of the graph here, we have a group of institutions that are sometimes called fourth branch institutions. These are the independent agencies of the government, such as media commissions, counter-corruption commissions, human rights commissions, ombudspersons. And these are formal institutions that should be independent of the government and can have a formal role in checking its power. And then also the media. Of course, if we don't have a free media that fearlessly reports upon what is happening in public life, then it's impossible for many of these other aspects of countervailing institutions to function properly. We can take a closer look at the progress of a few of these countervailing institutions in particular. So on the left, we have a graph of the number of countries that are making progress or falling behind in terms of effective parliament. And many of these graphs will look similar in that there were many countries making progress in the 1990s. That progress continues up until about 2010, and then we have a slightly different trend emerging. And in the most recent year for which we have data, 38 countries were in decline and 19 were making progress in effective parliament. Credible elections, as we measure it, includes a lot of consideration of the autonomy and efficacy of the electoral management body, one of those key fourth branch institutions. And here we see that the trend is quite negative, with 30 countries decline and 12 making progress. The trend for independence of the judiciary is slightly different. Again, great progress in the 90s, but we see actually many countries making progress still up until about 2020, and that is where the trend definitively diverges, and we have 15 countries in decline and only 7 making progress. But again, participation stands out as an area of strength, even in unexpected places. So the level of participation is quite high in consolidated democracies, but it's also high in Indonesia, as we mentioned, high in Mongolia, in India, Pakistan, and also many of the countries of West, Southern, and even East Africa that are not strong performers across the board of all of the indicators of democratic performance, but perform very well in terms of participation, also in South America. And so this, as I've said, is an area of strength on which we can build, that there are many people willing to participate in public life, and that if we can support the institutions, then this will tend towards supporting democracy more broadly. To sort of summarize what we've discussed so far this morning, democracy has continued to decline in 2023. And these declines have had particular impacts in terms of representation and rights, and this touches every region of the world. And that we've suggested that countervailing institutions, a broader understanding of where the institutions are that can check government power and maintain popular control, is a helpful way to understand the way forward, and that popular participation can be the motivation of progress that can carry us forward. And I'll just very quickly, I think I've gone on fairly long now, I'll very quickly touch upon the policy recommendations that are in the paper. So first, in terms of representation, this will be no surprise to you that we argue that we need to safeguard the fundamental institutions of representative government. In terms of rights, that we have to fight against the threats to civil liberties, defend the work of the media and of civil society. In terms of the rule of law, to protect the independence of judicial bodies and also of these fourth branch institutions that can serve as a further area of accountability for government power. There are also many countries where the personal integrity and security of citizens is under threat, and so we need to protect that as well. And finally, and hopefully, that if we prioritize public participation and innovation in institutions that can make participation more effective, this will be the way forward to support democracy. So thank you very much once again for the opportunity to be part of this important event and to present this report to you. And you're encouraged to read the report online at this link. And if you'd like to sign up for our newsletter, there's a QR code on the screen for you there. Thank you.